All right, today we're going to be talking about object-oriented programming, and if I could choose just one topic that you could learn from this whole course, it would probably be the object-oriented programming, like for sure, because um, this is basically the main thing that you need to know when it comes to programming, because everything that you will be doing after you get out of this program will be regarding object-oriented programming. So everything that we've learned so far will be implemented using object-oriented programming the further you go in your coding journey. All right, so let's start. So everything started with coding from procedural programming. And what procedural programming is, it's simply think of modules and the lecture that we had on methods and modules. So that is exactly what procedural programming is. You are just using modules to perform any sort of operation, any sort of issue that you have, you are solving it with a help of a method or a module. So that is also where the procedural comes from, the procedural part. Procedure, the same thing as module, function, method, it's the same idea. So you are taking an issue and you're solving that issue with the help of methods. However, the larger your program gets, the more complex your issue gets, the harder it is to solve that issue with just methods. So that is where object-oriented programming comes in. When we started creating very big systems such as social media or any games that you are playing on your computers, those use object-oriented programming. And just because they're so huge, they're so large, so that's exactly where object-oriented programming came from. Procedural programming was not performing good enough anymore. So what is object-oriented programming? Object-oriented programming, it's revolving around creating objects, and then those objects will contain some data fields. So those objects will have some characteristics assigned to them. And then also those objects will have their own modules, their own methods that can be used specifically on those objects. So basically think of it as combining your variables and combining your methods together based on some certain characteristics. You combine them together and you assign them to one type of something. It doesn't have to be a person, it doesn't have to be a vehicle, it doesn't have to be anything like that, but you're just assigning similar variables and similar methods to one entity, to one object. Now, the data, so as I said, an object combines both data and procedures. And that data that I was talking about is known as objects fields. And what that means is just variables. So any variables that object has, that is called objects fields. I will be referring to them as variables most of the time. So just know of the term objects fields. Now, also, there's two terms that you need to be familiar with. These are encapsulation and data hiding. So encapsulation is pretty simple. The encapsulation just means that you're combining those variables that your objects have with the methods that your objects have. So you're combining the data and you're combining the code together into one single object. That what means what they mean by encapsulations. Now, when it comes to data hiding is a term that stands for being able to hide certain things from that object that we have created from anybody outside of that object. So data hiding is basically you're hiding the things that you want to hide from anybody who does not belong to that object. And another benefit why we use object-oriented programming is because of object reusability. This is one of the most important parts why we use it, is because once you create an object, for example, if we have a social media, right? You're writing a social media website, like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, doesn't really matter. You're writing that, you will have a lot of different people, right? And all of those different people, they will have different characteristics, such as different name, different interests, different friends. However, one thing that combines all of them is that each one of those accounts is a real person. So you will know that each one of these accounts, they will need to have a full name, they'll need to have their own feed, they'll need to have their own friends, right? An option to add friends or remove friends. So instead of creating different account, writing code for different account of each person, you can just create one object that will stand for an account, and then you can reuse that object over and over and over again. The only thing that you will need to change is the specifications of that object. However, instead of creating multiple different accounts and writing code for each one of the people that create an account in your social media, you will just need to create one object that stands for an account. And then that object will be assigned, that same object will be assigned to each of the people that are creating a new account in your system. All right, classes. So classes is another thing that comes with object-oriented programming, and you need to think of it as a blueprint for your object. So for example, think of a house, right? We have a blueprint for a house, like for example, a two-story house. We can build as many two-story houses with that as we want. For example, let's say we have one blueprint and we created 3 houses that all look the same. They all have been created from the same blueprint. However, we can specify different attributes of that house. For example, in one of them, the roof will be red. In the other one, the roof will be brown. And in the last one, the roof will be blue or something like that. So these, the blueprint of those houses will be called the class. In terms of programming, will be called the class. And then the houses that we create, those are the objects. So they will have different, they might have different attributes. However, they all come from the same blueprint. So all of those objects come from the same class. So class will always have some vague, some, how do I say, some basic data fields that your objects will have later. Just think of it as a blueprint for, a class is a blueprint for your objects. To create a class, usually, and we're gonna do pseudocode, but usually it's the same in all of the other languages. It's something similar to this. So you're gonna put a keyword class, then you're gonna specify a class name. Usually the class name has to start with a capital letter to identify that it is a class and not a variable or a method. So you have to specify that it is with a capital letter. Then you're gonna, inside of the class, you're gonna put any variables that you want your future objects to have, and any methods that you want your objects, future objects also to have. And then you're gonna specify that you're ending class or not. It just depends. In some languages, it's you have to put a semicolon. In some languages, you have to close a parentheses. There's gonna be some sort of a character that's gonna specify that you are ending your class. Now let's see, there's also such thing as access specifiers. They come in with object-oriented programming. So the private, if you specify that anything that's inside of your class is private, that means that nobody outside of that class can access those private fields. However, if you put public access specifiers on any variables or on any methods, that just means that anybody who wants to access those fields or those methods outside of the code, they will be able to access those members of your class. It is a very common practice, and this is how good programmers do. They specify the fields, so any variables that your object has, we specify them as private, and then any methods that your class has, we specify them as public. So just remember, variables are private, methods are public. Now let's look at an actual example of a class. So for example, we have here a class that's called cell phone. Now, these are all of your data fields, which are your variables. They're set to private. We have a variable called manufacturer that is assigned a string, then model number that is also a string, and then the retail price that is a float or a decimal number. In this case, they're called real, but it's the same thing. Real, float, decimal, doesn't really matter. Then we have our methods. So we have a method to set the manufacturer of our phone. right here, in case, because we can create from this class, we can create many different cell phones. However, there are so many different manufacturers, so many different models, so many different prices for each of the phones. So we are just creating these basic variables that each object will have. And then we are allowing the user to set the manufacturer of their phone, set the model number of their phone, and set the retail price of that phone. For example, if we are creating a phone, let's say phone 1 will be P1, will be manufacturer will be Apple, then P2 will be Samsung, and P3, let's say it's Google. P3 will be Google. Now, all of these objects, P1, P2, and P3, they will belong to the same class, to the class of cell phone. So they are, technically, they will be the same, right? They are all objects, they're objects of the class cell phone. However, they will all have different fields. They will all have different variables, and that is totally okay. This is why we're creating a class first, because this way we can create all of these objects from just one instance of a class, instead of writing all of this code that we have here, writing it for each of the phones that we have. If we had, for example, like 1,000 phones, that would be 31 lines of code for each one of those 1,000 of phones. Instead, we're writing 31 lines of code, and then we can create as many objects as we want by just writing one line that says create an object of cell phone. Okay, let's see. As you can see here, this is how we will create our objects. So we're gonna declare that we are creating a my phone object of the class cell phone. And then after that, we are creating the actual object right here. Set my phone. My phone is the new object of the class cell phone. So this is the way how we would create an object using the cell phone class as is Blueprint. However, right here, what you can see here from lines 12 to 14, this is how we will set our values of the my phone object. We're setting the manufacturer to Motorola right here. Then we're setting the model number to be M1000, and we're setting the retail price to be 199.99. So instead of writing, creating a completely new phone and writing all of this code that we have right here, just for one of the objects, we can create as many objects as we want with that class by just writing 4 lines of code. Instead of writing 31 lines of code, we just need to write 4 lines of code, and we can create as many objects as we want, as many phones as we want, and set the manufacturer, model number, and the retail price to whatever we want. All right, let's look. Constructor is another thing that comes with classes. Constructor is something that is called automatically when you're creating your object. So right here, when we created our object right here, a constructor has been called already. You don't see it anywhere in here. However, behind the screen, a constructor has been called. And what constructor does, constructor just initializes any variables that your object has. So it initializes it with starting values. In this case that we had right here, our variables, they're not equal to anything, right? We don't have any default values. So they're going to be all equal to 0 or null. It just depends on which language you're using. Or they can also be null, which just means nothing. So whenever we called our class to create an object, we have initialized the fields of my phone, the variables of my phone, to zeros. So manufacturer was 0, model number was 0, and the retail price was 0. That's what constructor does. Constructor just initializes your variables of your object with starting values. Now, UML diagram, I think we already covered it a little bit, Unified Modeling Language. So this is how you would describe your object-oriented systems. At the first line, you will put the class of your, the name of your class. Then on the second one, you're going to put any variables that that class has. And on the last line, you're going to put any methods that your class has. Inside of each, you will specify which access your variable or field has, which is private or public. If it is private, you will put a plus. Oh, if it's public, you will put a plus. If it's private, you will put a minus, which just means plus stands for anybody can look at your code that is outside of your code, and minus stands for nobody can look at your code who's outside of that class. Yeah, as you can see, this is an actual example cell phone of that class that we just looked at. We have the name of it at the very beginning, cell phone. Then we are specifying that our manufacturer variable is a string and it is private. The minus stands for private. Then model number, we also have a variable called model number that is a string, is also private. Then we have a retail price that is a real or a float or a decimal, whatever you want to call it, and it is also private. And then we're specifying all of the methods that exist inside of our class, and we're just specifying that they are all public. Inheritance, another thing that comes with object-oriented programming is that you can inherit, classes can inherit each other, or I mean, not each other. The class can have a relationship with another class. And what that means, just think of it as parents and children. So we have a class that we have right here, insect, right? And all insect will have certain characteristics, such as, you know, they're living creatures, they eat whatever they eat, like they eat something, they breathe, they have some sort of body. However, some of those insects are different from the others. So in this case, if we are creating an insect class, we can also create two subclasses that belong to the insect class. One of them will be, for example, the bumblebee, and bumblebee has a unique characteristic to sting whoever they see, they can sting. But then also another insect is a grasshopper that can jump really high. So for example, we created an insect class that just has the basic characteristic of every insect. And then we also created a class for the bumblebee and a class for the grasshopper. And those two will inherit all of the characteristics of a regular insect. However, they will also add their own characteristic inside of their own classes. And the last thing that we're going to cover today is polymorphism. And polymorphism is just an idea, is just a term that stands for your ability as a coder to create different methods that's going to have the same name as long as they belong to different classes. So different classes can have the same methods that can perform different actions, that can mean different things, as long as they belong to different classes. They are not related to each other. Yeah, that is polymorphism for you. Polymorphism refers to an object's ability to take different forms, which just stands for an idea that if two classes have the same method that has the same name, they can perform different things. That is not illegal to do. That is not a bad thing to do. That is just object-oriented programming. All right, let me stop sharing my screen.